This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, uh, welcome to the training, Incorporating Adolescent Brain Development into Youth Programming. I am Robin Donaldson, the Chief Operations Officer at Indiana Youth Service Association, and I will be facilitating today's training. Before we start, I want to talk about what adolescence is. And adolescence really is not something that is defined by an age range, but rather it is a process. It is this process of moving from childhood to adulthood. And this includes becoming kind of independent, both psychologically, financially, socially, as well as emotionally. It does include those changes those physical changes that accompany puberty. However, it is much more than that, and it really is a long process that is very individualized for each person. We also need to understand that this is a time period where young people are working on two fairly significant developmental tasks, according to Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory of development. So his stage of adolescence, he would define as 12 to 18, but we now know that adolescence, because it is this process and things have changed in our society, really extend until about the mid-20s. And during this period of time, Erikson says that kids are working on two tasks. The first is to develop who they are, and that is that identity. So kind of finding out what's important to them, which they do so a lot of times by testing limits. They are focusing on figuring out what's important to them, what they want to do with their lives, what their values are. And typically this is going to happen in early adolescence. And then once kids kind of have an idea or sense of that, they work on this second developmental task, which is kind of developing their own independence and autonomy. Again, they are trying to figure out who they are as a person, and that's why they may kind of break those ties that they have with their parents or other important adults in their lives. But it is really kind of becoming their individualized person. And when they're not able to do that, and this often can extend into the middle 20s, they experience this kind of role confusion where they're not really sure what they want to do, and they kind of float through life. This is pretty uncomfortable for them when they're not sure, and they're still trying to find their way. And like I said, this is individualized, and this can continue well into a person's mid-20s or sometimes even beyond. Because this does happen, again, kind of at different ages, we typically will see kids who begin to kind of test those limits. They distance themselves from the adults in their lives. They may begin to kind of reject different things because they want to make a decision on their own about who they are and what's important to them. And so it's very, very important for the adults in their lives to understand that this is a very, very normal process. That kind of what feels like rejection of the young person really is them beginning to kind of decide for themselves what's important. When adults have a really good relationship with the adolescent, then a lot of times they will adopt those same values, those same interests that they had previously rejected, but that's because it was their choice. And they kind of begin to interact with adults on a more kind of even playing field, if you will. So as adults, understanding that this is a normal process, and providing them with different opportunities to figure out who they are, to allow them to explore different interests, whether it is sports, music, some of the arts, explore different career interests, but providing them with the opportunities to kind of see what those things look like, to almost to try it on and to see if that fits for them, and what is comfortable for them. So, providing those opportunities would be a great way for adults in youth programming to allow kids to kind of understand what fits for them and what feels comfortable so that they can establish that identity. As I said, typically we see this in early adolescence, so usually in around middle school. It can last, typically through the mid-high school years. A lot of kids will become comfortable and figure this out, who they are, who they are right around the sophomore, junior year of high school. For some kids, they will be able to do this earlier than that. Other kids, it's going to take a little bit longer, really depending upon the opportunities that they have to explore. But once they really become comfortable in their skin, and sometimes this can be co-current as well, they also begin to focus, especially right around the junior year of high school or so, focus on the second developmental task that Erikson has identified, and that is kind of establishing their own autonomy and independence. So they are looking for ways to kind of become their own person, to make their own decisions, and to take responsibility for themselves. So there are lots of different ways that we can do this as adults to help kind of support this autonomy and independence. And one of the best ways to do that is really to kind of provide them with their own space. So that can be, allowing them to pick out their own clothing. Of course, and teenagers, we typically don't want to buy their own clothing because they're not going to wear what we buy for them anyway. But allowing them that freedom to decorate their space the way that they want to. Usually around the junior year, kids are starting driver's ed, and so they become more mobile and be able to kind of get around on their own. So providing them with that, supporting that opportunity for them to kind of make choices about their own space, about their, how they want to express themselves. And that mobility is also going to be really, really important. I would tell parents when I was working as a counselor at the youth shelter in Bloomington that if the color of their child's hair was the biggest thing that they had to worry about, they really had it made. Because that was just a part of this natural expression. Certainly you have conversations with kids about how people will make assumptions and interpret those types of things, but really, that's not a big deal when all is said and done. We also can help support kids in the search for their autonomy and independence through helping them understand what fiscal responsibility is, helping them not only find jobs, but also keep jobs. A lot of times teenagers are really good at finding jobs, but they don't understand what it really means to be a worker, to have that responsibility to other people, to have to do what someone else tells us to do. That's not typically something that they are looking for in this age, because they really want to establish that independence. So how they can negotiate and navigate those two different demands, their own independent demand for autonomy and independence, but understanding that we do have to be responsible to others and kind of follow the rules and do what our bosses tell us. So those are all conversations that we can have with our young people as they move into this, task of establishing autonomy, independence, so that they know what to expect. And they also know that it's not really clear cut that they have this kind of navigation that they have to do between what they want to do to be independent, but also still, what we have to do just to be a responsible citizen and be responsible for the needs of others. So that's just kind of the developmental stage in which we are going to frame this conversation about brain development, because we now know so much, within the last 30 years about the brain that we just simply didn't know before. But in the 80s, when I went to college, we were told that the brain was at 12 was the adult brain, because it actually was the same size. The brain it's really adult size at the age of 12, and there wasn't the medical advancements that we had to be able to look into the brain and see what was different. Now we know that the brain will continue to develop and change pretty much throughout the lifetime, but it really does the majority of its maturation and kind of finishing touches, if you will, in the 20s. Most of that's going to be in the prefrontal lobes, and that area of the brain is responsible for all of our higher reasoning and decision making, as well as higher emotional control. And we still do not know what we don't know about the brain. There's so much more to understand. So, this is something that changes almost, on a yearly basis as we have technology that provides advanced kind of ways to look into the brain and figure out what's going on. So, understand that what we talk about now is always open to change as we learn more about the brain. So one of the things that changes in adolescence is neural growth. And we're going to talk about neural growth and how a lot of times this growth really mimics what happens at different stages in the life. But adolescence is the period of time in our lives where we experience the second greatest growth. And that's both physical growth as well as neural development. And so growth in our brains. And so we could kind of use this picture here. You see the neural growth, the neurons that are present in the brain at birth, and then just 3 months later, the difference, and 15 months. This super kind of connectivity, a huge growth spurt in terms of the number of neurons and their connections. And that is because the brain has this pattern of, kind of developing a lot of neural growth and those connections during developmental periods where there's some really significant changes. So at about 15 months, that's really when we see a huge growth spurt in language development. And the brain is getting ready to make that huge change and develop this really important cognitive and social skill of speaking and learning how to talk. And we see this copied at different periods throughout a person's lifespan. So when we really have to, we see this is kind of copied right around 4 and 6, and then we see this copied in pre-adolescence because of all of the things that we have to learn. And this is going to be, this, like I said, happens in pre-adolescence because there's so much that happens and so many different things that we have to learn. But this is a very targeted growth when we talk about this in pre-adolescence. It typically will happen in the temporal lobe between the ages of 7 and 11. And so you see kind of on the screen here, the temporal lobe is on the side of the brain. It is on the outside. So when we talk about lobes, we are talking about the cortex, the outside of the brain. And the temporal lobes on both the left and the right side house a brain structure that's called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the structure that is primarily devoted to learning and memory, especially when we are talking about memories of kind of academic or cognitive types of things. So, there are other places in the brain that hold memory, but when we are really talking about learning, especially school things, we're talking about the hippocampus. And so we see this huge growth spurt in the temporal lobe. So the brain really is getting ready to learn. And we think about all of the things that we do have to learn between the ages of 7 and 11. We're talking about elementary school here, learning basic math skills, learning how to read and how to write properly, socially, learning how to get along with others, how to communicate our wants in an effective way, how to negotiate conflict, and how to fit in with groups. So lots of really important skills that have to happen, and the brain goes through this growth spurt so that it's ready to absorb that learning and be able to process that efficiently. However, there is a change that happens in adolescence, and that is called the synaptic pruning. So again, we see this is neural growth in the brain. These are neurons. You have the cell body that's kind of the command center. You have these dendrites that reach out to receive information from other parts of the cell. And then this is the axon that will kind of communicate to other neurons. And so this is kind of spaced out. So this communication that happens between neurons is going to be kind of difficult at birth, but then we see at 7 this density. So all of these connections and the space between neurons is called a synapse. And we want to be able to have all of these different connections so that we can kind of solidify the neural communication and solidify those skills and the abilities to do those types of things. You'll see that at these different age where we have these huge developmental tasks, you'll see this density of neurons that actually the dendrites are going to grow, they're going to reach out and have multiple opportunities for connections with other neurons, so that the communication will happen. It will happen faster. It will happen efficiently. And then starting right around adolescence, the brain goes through this process that's called synaptic pruning. And this is very similar to the concept of pruning. Let's say if you are a gardener, if you have a rose bush or you have a fruit tree, one of the things that happens is that you have to cut off the dead branches so that they don't continue to kind of soak up nutrients. You might also even prune off healthy branches so that the fruit bearing or the flower bearing parts of the brain or the branches or the tree are able to really develop, really succulent fruit or really beautiful blossoms and that. And so we prune so that what is left is very, we have a higher quality of that. And that's kind of what's going on with the brain. So anything that's not being used in things that we are not able to introduce in that pre-adolescent period, if they're not used in different parts of the brain, then this pruning will cut away some of those dendrites. Especially it's based upon this use it or lose it principle. What we are left with is a really efficient brain. And so it is a positive process, but we also might lose some opportunities to really engage kids in different types of skills and learning if we're not introducing those types of things. So we have a more efficient brain. The adolescent brain loses about 3% of gray matter. That's actually neurons. Most of this is happening in the prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal lobes, remember, responsible for higher cognitive skills and emotional control. But we'll be left with a very efficient brain once this occurs. So things that we need to think about when we understand that this is going to happen, this synaptic pruning occurs on a very natural basis in adolescence, is we will really want to be able to expose our young people to a variety of different opportunities, learning opportunities, different experiences, to kind of find that thing that fits for them. Remember, they're trying to figure out who they are and what they want to do and what they want to be and what's important to them. And what skills they want to develop. So when we provide these opportunities, not only do we help them kind of establish their own identity, that kind of developmental task that's really important at this age, but we also then are going to make sure that that parts of the brain that's responsible for processing these different skills, these different abilities, will stay intact. That we create those neural connections for these skills. And that can be academic, it can also be social as well. But if we are allowing them to develop these skills, to practice these types of things, then the chances that those neurons will be pruned are going to be less because they're using these different skills and these different abilities. So we want to capitalize on this and introduce them to all different types of experiences. Another change that happens in the adolescent brain is around what's called long-term potentiation. And this really is about the sensitivity of the neurons being able to communicate to each other. So communication within a neuron is electrical, but communication between neurons is chemicals. So what you see down here is the end of it's the axon, and it ends in kind of like this umbrella spoke-like kind of thing with these seminal buds. So this is what these are down here, that contain neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are the electrical chemical communicators in our brain. When this neuron is stimulated and that communication happens electrically within the neuron, and it gets down to this part, it's going to stimulate the release of these neurotransmitters. And it's going to float across the synapse, which is the space between the neurons. And on this postsynaptic, so on the other side of this synapse, we have receptors to receive the neurotransmitters. And there are lots of different receptors for different neurotransmitters. We have several different types of neurotransmitters in our brain and receptors that will be there to receive those. In a normal circumstance, this is kind of what it looks like. You'll see this is what a neuron and that synapse will look like in an initial stage. So before you introduce any type of learning, and then you have introduced, whether it is a skill, whether it's a knowledge, but it's, kind of repeated stimulation around something, skills or knowledge. And then you look at the brain, and just 1 week later, with an introduction of repeated kind of skills or knowledge, you see how much more sensitive these neurons are to be able to communicate, how much more efficient. So we have more neurotransmitters that are able to release, more receptors on this postsynaptic neuron to accept that information. And what happens in adolescence naturally is that they're kind of more around this state to be able to enhance communication. So their long-term potentiation is stronger. They have a greater ability to communicate because not only are there more neurons, as we saw in the pre-adolescent stage, but also those neurons are more sensitive and ready to communicate to one another. Practically speaking, we also have to help kids understand, and we have to understand ourselves, that there are lots of things that pose risk to long-term potentiation. So long-term potentiation, that ability for those neurons to communicate to one another, it is decreased by most substances. Alcohol depresses the system and decreases the ability to communicate, as does marijuana. Most of these really are will result in the lessened ability of neurons to communicate to each other. Sometimes, because it will affect the presynaptic, sometimes it will affect the postsynaptic, sometimes it affects both of those. So using stimulants or ADHD, having ADHD, that also decreases long-term potentiation, as does stress and sleep deprivation. None of us multitask very well, but when we do that constantly, again, this will decrease long-term potentiation. The only thing that actually has a different effect is nicotine. And nicotine actually creates its own receptors in the brain. And so if nicotine is introduced in adolescence, it nearly doubles, if not more so, the potential for a young person to be addicted to nicotine because it creates receptors, but it creates it in adolescence at a much, much higher rate. It creates those receptors at a much, much higher rate than it does in any other age period. And so a lot of these things will work on what we call the 5-15-25 principle. And that is people who begin a substance, who introduce things like alcohol, other types of drugs, or nicotine, are 5 times more likely to develop an addiction than if they wait until after the age of 25 to start using these substances. So again, they're 5 times more likely to develop an addiction if they begin these things, if they introduce these things into the brain at 15 or younger than if they wait. And that's because the brain is still developing. And it has these certain vulnerabilities that are present in adolescence that aren't present in any other period of time. So we need to educate our kids about this, and so help them understand the choices that they're making now really do have long-term consequences. Another difference between brain development in adolescence as opposed to any other time, particularly, let's say, toddlerhood, even though there's lots of parallels, is the type of synaptic growth. So when we are talking about that synaptic growth in, let's say, toddlerhood, and in kids who are 0 to about 3 or 4, a lot of this is inhibitory, which means that kids are learning how to control themselves. They're learning not to hit. They're learning to wait and take turns. They're learning to control their body through potty training. They're learning to kind of to not do things as opposed to learning, so the growth spurt that happens is about calming that and reducing that communication in the brain as opposed to creating a response. And that's the excitatory part, being, just making sure that that communication happens. And adolescents in their brain, that brain response is all of the synaptic growth is excitatory. It's all about firing those neurons and creating some type of response, getting some type of behavior as opposed to the inhibitory type of growth that we see in toddlers. So think about, how many times kids are just immediately, reacting and doing something, and that's because their brains are primed to respond. They are primed to really kind of go and to actually do stuff without thinking about it first. So one of the things that we can do is kind of slow that down. And what we really want to do is promote the development of the prefrontal cortex. Remember, the higher learning, all of the higher learning processing happens in prefrontal cortex, and we can do that by asking leading questions, by asking them to think through things. And this can happen, either as a preventative measure, or if kids have done something that has been less than optimal and maybe has gotten them in trouble, we can still have these conversations afterwards, asking them, what if questions. What do you think would happen if you did this? Maybe they're having a social problem with a friend and they want to go and confront them or whatever it is. Ask them, what do you think is going to happen? What do you want to happen? What would be the consequences if you acted this way? What might be another way to get? What do you want? What is your goal in this? What do you want? And what are other ways to get this? So, kind of helping them think through those things, really just by having thoughtful conversations. You're asking that, you're helping them kind of think through. What they're doing is engaging prefrontal cortex. That, it's an opportunity for them to learn and to develop those connections. Help them think through logistical considerations. If they want to be a doctor, they want to be a veterinarian, then what do they have to do to get there? What can they do now that will impact their long-term goals to get into a good college, to be able to practice the way that they want to develop that career? So helping them think through those logistical steps of getting what they want. They want to get their driver's license. So what do they have to do in order to get that? What has to be in place? A lot of times they're thinking big picture and they're not able to kind of pull it down to these steps that need to happen before we get to that long-term goal. So helping them think through that process is going to be a way to really engage the brain, develop that excitatory synaptic type of development in ways that we want them to. So actually being thoughtful around some of these questions about what they need to do to get to their goals. The prefrontal cortex, as I said, it will be the last part of the brain to develop. Often this is not fully developed, and these changes will continue into the mid-20s. And the prefrontal lobes really are important to a lot of different things. And one of the really important things that prefrontal lobes are responsible for is this higher emotional control. Emotional control. And I'm not talking about the experience of emotion, because the experience of emotion comes in the limbic system, kind of this deep mid part of the brain. But the prefrontal, so how we control our emotions, how we behave because of that emotional experience is, part of the job of the prefrontal cortex. So we want this control loop to be in place. We want, we might feel something, information comes into the brain, it's processed in the limbic system. The limbic system will particularly the amygdala, will activate a response, but we want the prefrontal cortex to be in control of what we do as a result of that emotion. And the amygdala will process this information, particularly if it's something that is threatening to us or fearful. Amygdalas hold emotional memory. Remember I said, hippocampus is responsible for most memory and learning, but if it's a really emotional memory, something especially that has maybe posed a threat to us, a physical threat. We'll hold those memories in the amygdala so that we can immediately process and compare new information to something that might be threatening. And if information comes in that looks like it might be something threatening, then the amygdala begins, it communicates to other parts of the brain for the release of hormones, the release of other neurotransmitters that start our fight or flight response. So the amygdala is kind of that processing center for determining whether or not things in our environment are safe. And the key to understanding, how emotional control develops is to know that this part of the brain is pretty much fully developed in adolescence, whereas the prefrontal lobes are not. So the emotional part of the brain, the amygdala also has been called our survival part of the brain, is developed when the thinking part of the brain has not developed yet. So often we will get emotional behavior as a result of this. Adolescence is also a time in which emotions are stronger and more intense than any other period of time. So when adolescents become very dramatic in describing things that happen to them, when it's the worst thing in the world or the best thing in the world, that is truly their experience. This is very intense emotion, very overwhelming. Remember, they feel it, but they don't have the emotional control part of the brain fully developed. So this is their experience. It is the worst thing. It is the best thing. And so as adults, we have to understand this is their experience. Not only is it more intense, but if it is a negative emotion, it lasts longer. It takes longer for them to kind of get over those negative emotions than it does for adults. Part of this will result in kids becoming very egocentric. So egocentric means that they're focused on themselves, that they kind of live in their own world. But remember, their developmental tasks are about figuring out who they are and how they're going to get and navigate their way through this world on their own. And so they need to be egocentric. They need to be self-focused and self-centered in thinking through these things and working through these developmental tasks. So that is going to be a natural kind of behavioral reaction that we see as a result of this. Because they are so self-focused, they tend to believe in what's called the personal fable, and that's that no one could possibly understand how they feel. They're the only person who's ever experienced this. So a lot of times you'll hear things like, you can't possibly understand, you don't know what I'm going through. And that's just a part of that egocentrism, kind of that self-focused piece that's very natural in adolescence. Teenagers also demonstrate heightened levels of self-consciousness due to this personal fable belief, and also due to something that's called imaginary audience, which we'll talk about later. They're very self-focused and very self-conscious, and very often have a hard time understanding that not everybody's thinking about them, because they're thinking about themselves all the time, and they don't understand that not everyone else is they're not doing the same thing. So things that we can do so it's practical implications and activities that we can do is really kind of be there with them, right? So active listening and modeling the behavior that we want. And this active listening, we talk about this a lot, but it really is about being present for that young person in the moment. That means that we're turning off the cell phones. We are not engaging in other things that are going around. We are giving our full attention to the young person that's in front of this. And the message that we're giving them when we do this is that they are important enough for us to fully engage and focus only on them. And that's huge. That gives a lot of really positive messages. We want to make sure that we understand their experiences, so we'll do a lot of asking for confirmation, repeating things back to them, in a way that is not that we know, and not as the authority, but we're asking for confirmation. So it sounds like this makes you feel X, Y, and Z. Is that right? So again, they're the expert, and we're only trying to understand them from their point of view. We're not trying to solve the problem. We are trying to be there with them in that moment. As kids begin to escalate, and this is, whether they're, in whatever situation, we can kind of bring them back down based upon the principle of synchronicity. We have in our brains mirror neurons, and those mirror neurons really kind of help us match other people. We feel maybe can be sometimes the same things. We feel the same emotions. That we will match people in terms of intensity. We match people in terms of volume and activity levels and emotions based upon these mirror neurons. Some of us have more, I guess, susceptible mirror neurons or more active mirror neurons. If you're somebody who cries anytime you see, somebody crying in a movie or just in person, whatever, that's those mirror neurons. They're there to help us create a connection with other people. This is all very subconscious. We're not really aware of this, but when we know that we have these mirror neurons and we tend to subconsciously match people, then we can use this to our advantage, to the advantage of the young person that we're working with. As they get really excited, as their volume will go up, they'll become much more expressive with gestures, their activity level, their intensity level, all of this increases. We can do the opposite. So if they're really getting upset, then we can become quieter. We can slow down our speaking. We want to make sure that we stay kind of restful, that we're not very demonstrative in terms of our gestures. We just get really still and quiet and slow. And one thing that we'll do is we'll make them curious, but they also will begin to match that. And so if we become quiet, if we become calm, then those mirror neurons are triggered in that young person, and they also will kind of come back down. Now, this is best to do before they reach the period of overload. Once they reach that kind of getting really, really upset, then we're not going to be able to do this. So we want to do this as they are starting to become upset. It's also very important to create some downtime for young people because it is exhausting to always have to feel like, people are judging you. You're trying to figure out what's going on in the world. So give them time, whether it's in programming, just to kind of have their own space, to be on their own, and allow them to kind of chill and process information. And then if they're, kind of thinking that everybody's looking at them, we want to help them find other explanations for that so that they understand, especially if it's a group of, it's a group of adolescents, they're all thinking about themselves, other people in that group are thinking about themselves just as much as the individual young person's thinking about themselves. They're not worried about everyone else because they're all in this process of being egocentric and trying to figure out who they are and what's going on. Because the limbic system, and especially that amygdala, is fully developed before the prefrontal cortex is developed, kids are not very good, adolescents are not very good at reading emotion. In fact, reading emotion, so looking at someone else, understanding what they're feeling, all of that is processed in the prefrontal lobe, not in the limbic system. We feel emotions in the limbic system. We process and respond to emotions in our prefrontal cortex, and that includes the emotions of others. So in this very famous experiment about recognizing the emotion of someone based upon their facial expressions, it takes adolescents a lot more cues, a lot more facial cues to recognize that what the emotion is, that this person is happy. We may say, oh, this person's happy down here, with 25% of kind of facial cues to happiness as adults, if we are practiced in doing that. It may take kids, 75%, adolescents, because again, that prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. They're not good at reading facial expressions. They're not very good at reading tones. And if they don't know what the emotion is, if someone's trying to be neutral, if they're trying to be, have a flat affect and not respond, adolescents tend to read those neutral or those unclear facial expressions as negative anyway. So we might as well be genuine, and kind of model the behavior that we want, if we are feeling some of those negative emotions. So things that we can help young people do, to learn how to manage their emotions, and read emotions, can be things like this. I used to play emotional charades with kids to help them develop their emotional intelligence. And I would just take this, which you can find on YouTube or Google, and just find this emotion charades. And I would just printed it off and cut it up, and we would just play charades. They would draw one out and they would act it out. The other kids would guess what it is. It's a lot of fun. It's hard to do. I would always kind of go first, to demonstrate it. But it just gives them practice to be able to understand that there are lots of different emotions. You're not just angry, sad, or happy. You can be frustrated, you can be embarrassed, you can be disappointed. And all of those are different ways of feeling. And we need to help them understand these, not only for themselves, but also recognize those in other people. So this is just a really kind of fun way of being able to do this. And I will say that we do a better job with helping our females in our society. We do a better job of helping our females read and express their emotions than we do with boys, because that's just kind of a cultural standard where, men are typically limited to being angry, and maybe they can be happy, but that just kind of depends too. But females can't be angry, because when we're angry, we're the B word. And so, there are limitations within our society, even outside of what our expectations are, that our adolescents are going to be responding to. So helping them understand, this is a very unrealistic expectation within our society, to expect, boys never to be sad, to expect females never to be angry, and then just kind of process that. So helping them identify their own emotions, recognizing the emotions of others, and then expressing those in a very, in a helpful way, iMessages, things like that, and then just really practice that control. A lot of times that will happen through role plays. All right. Prefrontal lobes are also responsible for our reasoning ability, and this is good because this means that we can provide our young people with learning moments. Because the prefrontal lobe is so dependent upon experience, we have the opportunity to really impact the development of prefrontal lobes. It's a learned skill, so we can provide them with those learning opportunities. All right. Prefrontal lobes are also responsible for impulse control. That is, we will often see kids who can tell us when we're sitting down talking to them what consequences might be and why certain behaviors might not be a good idea. But when they are in the moment, when they're really feeling things, because the limbic system is fully developed and the prefrontal is not, and impulses are controlled in the prefrontal, we may see behaviors that, this just doesn't make sense. We think, oh, they're not paying attention. It's not that they're not paying attention, and they can tell us, negative consequences of certain behaviors, but in the moment they kind of lose this ability to kind of engage that prefrontal cortex and exercise that control. So we do see things like thrill-seeking behavior, and this actually is present in adolescents more than it is in any other age group. They have a greater need for thrill-seeking, and a lot of this is because the reward center of the brain is also located in the limbic system. It's also located in that mid part of the brain. And that's fully developed. And so they're really kind of trying to feed that through thrill-seeking behaviors. Because that part of the brain is developed and prefrontal cortex is not, things like consequences and understanding, what's going to happen, and they're not engaging that. They very often will engage in this invincibility syndrome, thinking that it can't happen to them. They know that this is a particular consequence, but it's not going to happen to them. And again, that's fully responsible, or because the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed there. So it is about brain development there. So things that we can do is we can provide them with safe thrills, right? We can engage and provide them opportunities for fulfilling that thrill-seeking behavior through recreation. Recreation is one way in which to do that. We may not be able to take our kids to amusement parks, depending upon kind of liability restrictions of our agencies, but we can provide them with really fun things through recreation. Just kind of, I think if we, engage our physical being, it does kind of provide some of that. Anything that's new, things that they haven't done before, also can activate that reward system. It does certainly activate a little bit of anxiety, but all of that's kind of in the same part of the brain. And it gets our attention. And so it really can provide them with those safe thrills. And also moving them, just a little bit outside of their comfort zone. So if we're doing activities, we're introducing new skills, things that they're not quite comfortable. We don't want to push them too far outside of their comfort zone, but something that creates maybe just a little bit of anxiety also will create that safe thrill. It kind of will fulfill that need because it's engaging the same part of the brain. All right. Prefrontal lobes are also responsible for determining cause and effect, right from wrong, and making sound judgments. And a lot of these things are going to be dependent upon learning in different situations. So they may be able to exhibit this stuff with us while they are with us in programming, and then they do something completely different at home, or they do something completely different at school. Adolescents, very much dependent upon repetition, upon being able to learn these new skills in all of their different situations. They don't transfer this knowledge very well from one situation to the other. So this means that we really need to be working with schools, working with parents to introduce opportunities to learn to engage these skills in all of their settings, because they may do it with us, but that is kind of situational dependent learning. And the cues, it might be our building, it might be us individually, will kind of activate that learning process. But because we're not there at home, we're not there with them in school or in their peer groups, they're not able to engage that learning. So we really have to support this through lots of repetition across all of the different areas. So one of the things that happens is teens really become very justice oriented as they enter early adolescence. This is because they understand abstract things. So they're now able to understand things like equality and justice and individual rights and all of these kind of abstract thinking. Their brains understand this now, but they're still very much seeing things black and white. So they have this strong justice orientation. They have this strong belief in their choice. Remember, they're learning to be autonomous, to be independent. So they have a very strong attachment to individual rights, but they're still seeing things very black and white. They are still very egocentric. So they may see inconsistencies in other behaviors, but they don't see the inconsistencies in their own behaviors. They'll point it out for us and then not be able to kind of see how they're doing the same thing. Or they begin to question adult rules and decisions because they now know that we can do things lots of different ways. They understand possibilities and hypotheticals. And so they want to know why we do the things the way that we do. And we better have a really good answer for them. And when we do, they're totally fine with it. And they'll follow those rules if there's a good reason for that. Okay, that makes sense to me. It's my choice then to follow that rule. But again, this ability to see gray, to be able to make kind of individualized decisions and understanding people on a case-by-case basis rather than just kind of this global black and white is still very hard for adolescents to do. And that kind of ability to see gray and understand that really doesn't develop until emerging adulthood. And that's like 18 to 24. So, they're still going to have a hard time with what they see as inconsistent behavior when really we're making kind of adjustments to individual cases. So because they have this strong justice orientation, this is a great time to engage kids in community service learning projects, to be able to kind of, corral all of that social justice interest appropriately, help them engage in new social awareness activities. It's difficult as an adult to kind of walk that tightrope between idealism versus realism, because adolescents are going to be very idealistic. And so how we help them navigate the real world with all of its restrictions and limitations without popping that bubble and making them become cynical. We just have to kind of help them figure that out. So, if we start to, maybe they want to do a social service, a community service or service learning project, help them through the logistical parts of what might happen and let them figure that out for themselves instead of saying, no, we can't do that. Well, what do you think would need? What kind of space would we have? What would be safety kind of issues, and help them figure that stuff out themselves. And then they start to begin to see some of those different gray areas, help them build empathy. And again, community learning, community projects and service learning projects are great ways to help them develop empathy and understand that, where someone else is. And we can also do this through role plays. And then just really help them explore all of the different possibilities. A lot of times we kind of default to the things that we know best, and there are lots of other ways to do things. So helping them explore what those might be. Because again, consequences, right from wrong, impulse control, all of these things develop in the prefrontal cortex, which is still not done during adolescence. We will see smart kids make very poor decisions, and we will see a lot of inconsistent behavior because, like I said, that they are not able to transfer learning from one setting to another. And so, this is, I would encourage you guys after this is over to go to YouTube, type in cheerleader through basketball hoop, and you will actually watch these college age cheerleaders. These are college cheerleaders. So we know that they are smart. They've gotten into college. We know that they can manage their time because you have to maintain grades in order to participate in extracurricular activities. These are kids who have skills to get them to where they are. And what they do is they actually these are the boy cheerleaders, the male cheerleaders, and they throw this girl, and if you find the right one, you'll hear her say, "Are you sure this is going to work?" They throw her up, she turns a flip and comes down through the basketball hoop. She does hit her head, but they're so busy, the guys are so busy celebrating that she went through the hoop that it takes them a while to notice that she did, because she, after she comes down, she's holding her head. And even when one comes over and asks if she's okay, once she nods, he still goes back to celebrating. Smart kids will make dumb decisions because prefrontal lobe is dependent upon learning this over and over and over again in multiple situations in different parts of their lives. And so it does require kind of that repetition, and for us to really be understanding of that fact, that just because they've learned it and they've demonstrated this once doesn't mean that they have it down pat, because it does depend upon that connection between the limbic system and the prefrontal lobe. The ability to be able to activate the neural activity in prefrontal lobe is dependent upon learning opportunities, and it takes a while for things to become habitual. And so that's what we're doing by offering them all of these opportunities to really learn. So when they make a poor decision, we try to find those natural consequences, things that automatically will make those connections for them, something that's easy to understand. If it is, when my second son went to high school, his freshman year, the very first time that he brought his report card home, and this was a kid who was in advanced learning in middle school. And the first time he brought his report card home to me, there were some C's and D's. And I looked at it and I asked him, what's going on? And he said, well, I'm not turning in my homework because I'm spending too much time talking to my girlfriend on the phone. Very honest kid. And so natural consequence was that, and I didn't take the phone away from him completely. He was just off the phone at 8:30 every night so that he had time to do his homework. That was a natural consequence. It was very much tied to the behavior that interfered with his ability to get his homework done. And that made sense to him. And, he didn't like it, but he abided by it because it was a natural consequence, and it made sense. We can, if we're working with kids, maybe we don't have the opportunity to do that type of consequence, but think about that in programming and engage the kids. And it's okay, so this is the behavior, this is why it was a problem. What do we need to do to get to the behavior that we want? Better decisions, whatever. And a lot of times they can come up with what that is. They can come up with those natural consequences. That we want them to learn. We don't want them to repeat the same behavior. We want them to learn something different. And that's really what we are targeting when we're talking about consequences, is the opportunity to learn something more successfully and to do things better the next time around. If you're working with kids in program, we can find out what those things are by working on targeted scenarios, having the kids write out the things that they struggle with so that it's actually real and meaningful to them. They give us those scenarios, and then we role play different ways in which to do things differently in those scenarios. If they're having a problem with a teacher, you role play communicating the issue that's at hand. You can do the same thing with peers. It's what's bothering them, what's real to them. And typically, if it's going to be for one person, it will also be applicable to the other teens that you have. And role play those situations. When it's more meaningful, they're going to pay more attention. When it's more meaningful, we're kind of actually activating some emotion kinds of things, and there's going to be a release of neurotransmitters, chemicals in the brain that's going to solidify that learning quicker and stronger. So make it meaningful and then give them the practice to role play those behaviors that make sense for them, things that are going to help them be more successful in the next time they face this situation. All right, so I just want to talk about some very general implications when we are talking about adolescent brain development. And one is that sleep is hugely important, not just for adolescents, but for everyone. But in adolescents, they do still need about 9.5 hours of sleep because of all of the different changes that are going on. We grow when we sleep, we solidify learning when we sleep. When we're sleeping, we reset neurotransmitter levels in our brains at the optimal levels that we need to be really efficient. That's when we heal. So we do a lot of really important things during sleep and during really good sleep. So encourage them to sleep. If they don't, adolescents aren't going to really, they have a different circadian rhythm, a different kind of time clock within their bodies. They're not really going to be ready to sleep until about 11 or 12 o'clock at night, but they have to get up so early to go to school. So give them the opportunity to engage in that catch-up sleep over the weekend so that they can make up for it. And catch-up sleep is a very real thing, and it has very real positive effects, not only physically, but also cognitively and emotionally. So, and tell this, let them know all of this stuff. Help them understand the risks of stress. Help them understand the risk of substances during this critical brain development time so that they can make informed decisions about what's going on and understand the risks that they may be engaging in by introducing substances during this time. Stress is one of those things that we talked about that is going, and stress is, whether it's an intense stress or long-term, just kind of moderate stress, is really, really negatively impactful on the brain. It actually will kill the dendrites in the brain, and so help them learn how to manage that stress. Introduce coping skills, introduce deep relaxation skills or deep breathing, introduce them to meditation or yoga. These are all very effective ways. If they can't reduce the stress, if they can't get away from those stressors in their lives, and a lot of times we can't, those stressors might be parents, they might be someone else in the home, they might be school, they might be, peers and bullying. There's a lot of stress in our lives. Maybe they can't get rid of that stressor, they can't get away from it, but we can help them manage that by reducing stress. Deep breathing is a really simple, easy way to shut off the stress response system. When we stop and we engage in deep breathing, we are shutting down the stress response system. We're stopping that drip of cortisol, which is the stress hormone that's really bad for our brains. And we're, kind of engaging prefrontal cortex. Relationships and positive relationships are also one of the most important things that we can give our kids to help offset the stress that they feel in their lives, because positive relationships activate oxytocin, which overrides cortisol, and also helps reduce that stress response. So help them find these things in their life so that they can manage that stress, stay on top of it, and be able to engage the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain, the thinking part of the brain that we want to be in charge, and we want to fully develop. I have a few listed my resources here. If you want additional resources, please feel free to reach out to me. This is my email address. If you're more interested in some of the more technical parts of brain development and those effects, I have a reading list to suggest to you. So just reach out, and again, feel free to contact me at any time. Thank you so much for choosing this particular workshop or video to watch. I hope that you found it very helpful, and I wish you all the best as you work with our kids. Thank you so much for the work that you do. I know it's not easy. I know it's stressful, and we want to provide you with all the support that you need to do so successfully, so that you can take care of yourself and also take care of our young people. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.